was a quiet October evening in Ouagadougou, the kind of stillness that often falls just before history decides to move. The air was heavy, the city wrapped in the kind of silence that hides expectation. Somewhere above, a lone helicopter circled in the dark. Down below, an unmarked convoy crawled toward the presidential palace of Kuluba. Inside those walls, a meeting was about to take place, one that would not make the headlines on CNN or BBC, but whose echo might one day reach every corner of the African continent. In that palace, two men from two very different eras were preparing to sit across from each other. One, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier turned leader of Burkina Faso, a man who speaks of sovereignty with the fire of youth and the calm of conviction. The other, Jacob Zuma, the elder from South Africa, once a comrade of Nelson Mandela, now a voice reminding Africa that freedom is never truly finished. Their handshake was not ceremonial. It was generational, a bridge between memory and momentum, between the age that broke chains and the one that refuses new ones. For the elder, it was a return to the battlefield of ideas. For the younger, it was a confirmation that the struggle of the past had merely changed its shape. Outside, the city slept under the thick Sahel dusk, unaware that within those walls, the conversation was not about diplomacy, but about destiny. What does independence mean when the flag is your own, but the currency is not? When the land is yours, but the profit leaves your borders? When your armies salute another nation's approval before defending their own soil? These were not academic questions to the two men who sat across that wooden table. For them, this was the unfinished business of liberation, a new front in an old war. If you stay until the end of this story, you will understand why what happened that night in Ouagadougou may not just change Burkina Faso. It could redefine what it means for an entire continent to be free, politically, economically, and most of all, mentally. When three nations stood together in September 2023 to sign the Liptako Gourma Charter, few in the global north paid much attention. But for those who understand the pulse of Africa, that moment marked the quiet birth of something seismic, the alliance of Sahel states, known simply as AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three countries joined not only by geography, but by a shared sense of betrayal. All had endured years of insurgencies, military interventions, and foreign assistance that often seemed more performative than purposeful. All had been criticized, sanctioned, or sidelined by the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, for their transitional governments. And all were led by soldiers who, despite their uniforms, spoke more like nationalists than generals. The AES was not born out of ideology, but necessity. At its heart, the charter declared a simple promise, an architecture of collective defense and mutual assistance. But beyond the diplomatic language, the message was unmistakable. We will no longer allow foreign powers or regional blocs to dictate our domestic affairs. We will stand together or not at all. Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged as one of the alliance's boldest voices. Where others used caution, he used clarity. In public speeches, he declared that Burkina Faso would not be a client state. In private meetings, he pushed for greater resource control, regional coordination, and political autonomy. To many in the West, his words rang alarm bells. To many Africans, they rang like long-awaited truth. The AES has since evolved beyond military cooperation. Leaders have discussed shared infrastructure projects, regional currencies, and joint diplomatic missions. There's even talk of building a new economic bloc, one free from the conditions that have long shaped the policies of ECOWAS, IMF, and others. Critics call it isolationism. Supporters call it sovereignty. In many ways, the AES is less a political organization than a declaration of refusal, a refusal to continue playing by rules written elsewhere. The member states are still struggling with real challenges, poverty, security threats, and political uncertainty. But their stance is unapologetic. They are not asking for approval. They are demanding agency. That context is essential for understanding why Jacob Zuma's visit to Ouagadougou in 2025 mattered. He didn't just meet a president. He met the architect of a new regional doctrine, one that sees strength in independence and unity in defiance. For Zuma, who had watched South Africa break free from apartheid's grip, this was more than familiar. It was familial, as the flags of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger flew together under the Sahel sun. What once seemed like a fragile experiment began to look more like the foundations of a movement not just to resist, but to reimagine. And at its core stood a leader not yet 40 years old, who dared to believe that Africa's borders didn't need to be redrawn, just its mindset. In the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traore and Jacob Zuma, the problem with African independence was never just about borders or flags. It was about power. More specifically, it was about who still holds it and how quietly it continues to operate behind the scenes. That's why when they speak of neo-colonialism, they are not invoking a metaphor. They are naming a system. To understand this system, you need to understand how it operates across three major fronts: money, military, and mind. First, the money. For much of Francophone Africa, currency remains tied to the past in the most literal sense. The CFA franc, used by 14 countries, is pegged to the euro and managed through institutions that still report to the French Treasury. For decades, these nations have been required to deposit a portion of their foreign exchange reserves, historically 50%, into an operations account in France. Though reforms have softened some terms in recent years, the underlying structure. Critics argue this system provides financial stability at the cost of monetary sovereignty. In simple terms, it means African nations can fly their own flags, but their money still kneels to someone else's vault. Next, the military. Foreign troops on African soil are not new. In the name of anti-terrorism and peacekeeping, countries like France and the United States have maintained military bases and trained local forces for years. But to leaders like Traoré, this presence has blurred the line between partnership and control. In 2024, Niger's transitional government ended its military agreement with the United States, calling the American presence illegal. A similar pattern had already unfolded with French troops in Mali, Burkina Faso, and later Niger. The pattern was clear. A new generation of African leaders was beginning to say no, not with hostility, but with clarity. Third, the mind. The most enduring form of colonization, according to Traoré, is the one that shapes how Africans think about themselves. Western media still dominates narratives about the continent. Development models promoted by international NGOs and think tanks often frame Africa as a passive recipient of help rather than a source of ideas and innovation. Education systems in many countries still carry traces of colonial influence. Even in art, film, and literature, there's a struggle over who gets to define what African success should look like. When Zuma says they believe our wealth belongs to them, he isn't only talking about gold or oil. He's talking about the architecture that allows others to extract value, financial, military, or intellectual, from the continent without ever needing to raise a flag. To him, and to Traoré, real liberation cannot happen unless Africa controls its own currency, secures its own land, and tells its own story. Without that, independence remains decorative, a symbol without substance. And it's not just about blame. It's about structure. Debt, for instance, has become a tool of quiet influence. Loans from the IMF and World Bank often come with conditions that shape national budgets. These conditions, fiscal tightening, deregulation, privatization, may serve global financial norms, but they rarely align with local realities. Over time, they can erode the very autonomy that post-colonial states fought to gain. Traoré has often described this as freedom with strings, and he's not alone. From Ghana to Guinea, voices are growing louder against what they see as the continuation of colonial logic by economic means. But here's the deeper point: this system doesn't persist because it's enforced by force. It persists because it's embedded in institutions, in agreements, in assumptions. That is the true face of neo-colonialism. It doesn't knock down your door. It rents your apartment, charges you for water, and tells you the blueprint was your idea all along. The conversation in Ouagadougou was not just about what's wrong. It was about how to break the cycle, how to build systems of ownership, security, and self-worth. For both Traoré and Zuma, that meant rejecting the idea that Africa must always ask for permission before taking action. And that's what made their meeting so powerful. It wasn't just a conversation about problems, it was a refusal to be silent about them. Long before Ibrahim Traoré wore the red beret that would become his trademark, another man had done the same on the very same soil: Thomas Sankara, known as Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara ruled Burkina Faso in the 1980s and inspired millions with his defiant stance against imperialism, corruption, and economic dependency. He was bold, uncompromising, and assassinated at just 37 years old. Decades later, a young captain emerged from the ranks of the military, echoing the very same convictions. When Traoré seized power in 2022, many dismissed him as just another soldier with a rifle and a speech. But what followed set him apart. He spoke of sovereignty not as a slogan, but as a blueprint. He did not wear suits tailored in Europe. He wore his uniform like armor for a political battlefield. He canceled defense agreements that had kept French troops on Burkinabe soil. He took direct control of national gold mines. And in every appearance, from military outposts to public rallies, he repeated one theme: Africa must stand for itself. To many, Traoré became more than a president. He became a symbol, especially to the youth. In Ouagadougou and beyond, his image appears on murals, t-shirts, and smartphones. Hashtags like We Are All Traoré and Second Liberation trend across West Africa, fueled not by celebrity, but by sincerity. What binds Traoré to Sankara is not just ideology, it's courage. Sankara renamed the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Traoré seeks to make that name real, not just symbolic. There are, of course, differences. Sankara led during the Cold War. Traoré leads during the Information War. Sankara faced colonizers who had just left. Traoré faces systems they left behind: debt traps, currency controls, and intellectual dependency. But in both men lies the same flame: the belief that Africa doesn't need saving. It needs space, room to choose its own path, to make its own mistakes, and to build from its own strengths. Traoré's critics call him too radical, too young, too impulsive, but that's exactly what some said about Sankara. And history, as it often does, now watches in silence, waiting to see whether this new leader will fall to the same traps or forge a new outcome. One thing is certain: Traoré is not trying to relive the past. He is trying to finish what was started and to protect it from being undone. His policies may be debated, his decisions scrutinized, but his message is impossible to ignore. It is the voice of a continent no longer asking for freedom, but demanding the full meaning of it. In that sense, he is not just following Sankara, he is extending him where Sankara said, "We must dare to invent the future." Traoré now declares, the future will no longer be negotiated. That is not nostalgia. That is evolution. Before he was a president, Jacob Zuma was a fighter, not in theory, but in the literal sense. As a young man in apartheid-era South Africa, he joined the armed wing of the African National Congress, known as Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. He spent a decade imprisoned on Robben Island, the same prison that once held Nelson Mandela. He knew what oppression felt like. He had tasted the cost of freedom. And decades later, in 2025, he found himself in a very different kind of. When Zuma arrived in Ouagadougou, he didn't come as a government envoy or a politician seeking headlines. He came as an elder one who had seen the first wave of African liberation and who now feared that wave had stopped too soon. Standing beside Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Zuma praised the direction Burkina Faso was taking. "What you are doing is remarkable," he said. "We must now ask how we, together, can continue the struggle for the liberation of Africa." Zuma's message was not nostalgic. It was a warning. He spoke of a continent that had traded colonial chains for corporate ones, of leaders who were independent in name but constrained in policy. He criticized global financial structures, called out multinational corporations, and reminded his audience that flying a flag means little if your economic lifelines are still held by others. For Zuma, platforms like BRICS, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, were more than just economic clubs. They were alternatives, in his eyes. BRICS represented a break from the Western-dominated world order, a chance for Africa to engage on equal footing, not as a dependent, but as a partner. Of course, Zuma is a controversial figure. His years in office were marked by both achievements and allegations. But here, in Burkina Faso, he was not the former president of South Africa. He was the former prisoner of apartheid, the old rebel who had once stood beside Mandela, now standing beside a new kind of revolutionary. His presence gave weight to Traoré's mission. It showed that this was not just a youth rebellion, but part of a larger historical continuum, one that began with independence, stumbled through structural adjustment, and is now rising again under a new banner sovereignty with substance. The symbolism was undeniable. A man forged in the fires of political oppression, handing the torch not in a ceremony, but in solidarity to a leader refusing to govern with borrowed convictions. Zuma may no longer hold office, but in Ouagadougou, he held something else memory, and he used it not to lecture, but to remind that the struggle never truly ended. It simply changed its disguise. If politics is power, then media is how that power explains itself. And in the case of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the alliance of Sahel states, the battle is no longer just on the ground. It's in the headlines, hashtags, and talk shows that shape how the world sees Africa's choices. When the three countries jointly withdrew from ECOWAS in early 2025, the reactions were swift and divided. In Brussels, the European Union warned of a troubling regional destabilization. In Washington, the U.S. State Department called for a return to democratic order. ECOWAS leadership expressed regret but kept diplomatic doors open. Meanwhile, the African Union offered a more nuanced stance, urging dialogue while affirming member states' right to self-determination. But official statements were just one part of the picture. On screens around the world, the story was being told with dramatically different tones. Western media outlets like CNN, BBC, and France 24 framed the shift in the Sahel as a democratic backslide, focusing on the military roots of the new governments. Terms like junta, strongman, and anti-Western pivot became standard descriptors. Criticism wasn't just about policies, it extended to personalities. Ibrahim Traoré, in particular, was cast as both unpredictable and defiant. Inside Africa, however, a different narrative was taking shape. Regional platforms such as Jeune Afrique, the continent, and African Arguments painted the situation with greater complexity. They highlighted how many citizens, particularly young people, viewed the AES as a long overdue break from externally imposed systems. Hashtags like "We're all Traoré" and African liberation spread across social media, not as orchestrated campaigns, but as expressions of pride and hope. In Mali and Burkina Faso, murals of Traoré went up beside quotes from Thomas Sankara. In Ghana and South Africa, intellectuals debated whether the AES signaled the dawn of a third liberation, one not just from colonizers or corrupt elites, but from inherited dependency. Amid this narrative clash, accusations flew in both directions. Governments in the Sahel suspended several French broadcasters, citing biased coverage. Critics countered that state-run media in AES countries were silencing dissent. The result wasn't just polarization, it was a fragmented truth, split by geography, ideology, and language. But beneath the noise, something deeper was happening. For the first time in decades, African citizens were not just reacting to global headlines, they were rewriting them. This is perhaps the most disruptive aspect of the current moment, not the military transitions or institutional exits, but the assertion of a new African voice, one that no longer waits for approval, one that dares to define its own reality. And in that new reality, the meeting between Traoré and Zuma became more than political. It became symbolic, not just of resistance, but of reclaiming the story itself. Liberation is a word Africa knows all too well. It has been shouted in the streets, written into constitutions, and sung in anthems. But over time, the noise faded, the battles ended, the flags were raised, and yet something always felt unfinished. The meeting between Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Jacob Zuma did not fix that feeling, but it did give it a name. It called out the quiet truth that many have felt, but few have said aloud, that the first independence won the flag, but not the field. That the continent may have broken the chains, but not the grip. Zuma brought to that conversation the weight of memory, the pain of apartheid, the price of resistance, and the burden of promises yet fulfilled. Traoré brought the force of momentum, the urgency of now, the clarity of conviction, and the courage to break what no longer serves. Together, they offered not a solution, but a direction. That direction begins by asking hard questions. What does it mean to be free in a global system that still punishes self-determination? What is sovereignty if your currency is controlled abroad? What is democracy if your media, your loans, your education all arrive with conditions? These are not rhetorical questions. They are structural ones, and they demand structural answers. Across the continent, and indeed beyond it, more people are beginning to ask these same questions, not out of anger, but out of inheritance from the debt crisis to the aid dependence, from security agreements to knowledge production. The architecture of the old world order still casts a long shadow. But shadows only exist where there is light. And what Traoré and Zuma showed in Ouagadougou is that light still exists in defiance, in dignity, in the decision to imagine something more. Africa's story is not over, in many ways. It has barely begun. It is not defined by coups or crises, but by the quiet courage of those willing to challenge systems written without them. It is not waiting for permission. It is writing in real time. If you have followed this story until now, then you are part of that writing. Because stories are not just told, they are remembered, shared, and passed forward. And maybe that's where freedom truly lives, not in flags or speeches, but in the stories we refuse to let die. So talk about this, reflect on it, challenge it, and above all, pass it on. Because Africa's second liberation will not be televised, but it can be told by you. Ow.